We will begin by providing a jurisdictional overview of the harassment and violence policies currently in place for employees of the House of Commons administration and of members, along with governing legislation and regulations. We will also overview the Code of Conduct for members of the House of Commons sexual harassment. We will outline the roles that the Board of Internal Economy and the Procedure and House Affairs Committee have played in their development. Thereafter, we will present the members of the House of Commons Harassment and Violence Prevention Policy in its current form, as well as the Code of Conduct for members of the House of Commons sexual harassment. We will then provide the committee with recent developments and address any questions that members may have. I will now invite our law clerk to provide a jurisdictional overview.
Merci, Eric. Il existe plusieurs politiques et codes.
There are various policies and codes that are aimed at preventing and dealing with harassment and violence in the workplace at the House of Commons. The motion adopted by the committee for this study mentions one, namely the members of the House of Commons Workplace Harassment and Violence Prevention Policy, which was adopted by the Board of Internal Economy. There's a similar harassment policy adopted by the Clerk of the House of Commons for the administration, and parliamentary partners are also legally required to adopt such policies. In addition, as members of this committee know, there's the Code of Conduct for members of the House of Commons, sexual harassment between members, which comes within the purview of the committee pursuant to Standing Order 108-3A9. The members of the House of Commons Workplace Harassment and Violence Prevention Policy was, as I mentioned, adopted by the Board of Internal Economy under its general authority over administrative matters involving the House and members. The policy is also part of the condition of employment and supports members in their role as employers of their staff. The policy applying to members and their staff was adopted by the Board of Internal Economy and replaced by a new policy, the one currently in place, following new regulations, specifically the Workplace Harassment and Violence Prevention Regulations. This came after the Canada Labour Code was reformed to include harassment as a health and safety matter and was made applicable to parliamentary employers, including members of Parliament. The policy was recently reviewed by the Board, but no substantial changes were made.
Conduct for members of the House of Commons sexual harassment between members. It resulted from a study of this committee following an order of reference from the House instructing the committee to examine policy options for addressing complaints of harassment between members and make recommendation for a code of conduct for the prevention and resolution of harassment in the workplace. As its title indicates, the Code of Conduct ultimately recommended to and adopted by the House is limited to sexual harassment. Following the 2018 review of the Code of Conduct sexual harassment, it was contemplated that PROC was to undertake a study on non-sexual harassment, but it did not begin such a study before the dissolution of the 42nd Parliament. The Code of Conduct sexual harassment constitutes an expression of and is rooted in the parliamentary privilege of the House of Commons to discipline its members, similar to the conflict of interest codes for members of the House of Commons. Both codes are appended to the standing orders. Going back to the members of the House of Commons Workplace Harassment and Violence Prevention Policy, it does not fall, as I said, within the mandate of this committee. That said, it's not the first time that the Board and PROC are both interested in the same matter. For example, in the 42nd Parliament, the issue of maternity and parental leave was studied by the Board. However, as it did not have jurisdiction over this subject, the Board referred the matter to this committee, which examined the subject and made recommendations to the House that were later adopted as the regulation respecting the non-attendance of members by reason of maternity or care for a newborn or newly adopted child. Inspired by this example, PROC could, should it determine that changes to the policy are required, write to the Board to suggest that there are amendments to the policy. I note that the Standing Order 108-3A1 contemplates such a collaboration between the BOI and the PROC, in that PROC can, as part of its mandate, review and report to the Speaker and the Board on matters related to the administration of the House of Commons. To conclude, whether harassment prevention or resolution proposal comes within the jurisdiction of the board or the House acting on the recommendation of PROC will depend on the circumstances. Harassment prevention as a health and safety matter in the workplace will generally come within the purview of the board as an employment matter. In contrast, regulating member-to-member conduct will be a matter for the PROC and the House to decide. I will now invite the CHRO to provide additional context respecting the content of these policy and the code.
So as outlined by the clerk, I'll begin by providing the committee with a brief overview of the harassment and violence policy, creation and development, its current state, and a distinction from the code of conduct for members of the House of Commons sexual harassment between members. La politique de prévention du harcèlement.
The members of the House of Commons Harassment and Violence Prevention Policy was approved by the Board on January 28, 2021, to replace the one approved by the House of Commons on December the 9th, 2014. The new policy is intended to help members of Parliament meet, as employers, the new legislative requirements of the Canada Labour Code that came into effect on January the 1st, 2021, as well as to foster a healthy, respectful, and harassment and violence-free work environment. The policy was recently updated and then approved by the Board on February 15, 2024. For your information, in accordance with the policy's requirements, I'll present to the Board on May 30th next the annual report on the members of the House of Commons Harassment and Violence Prevention Policy for the 2023-2024 fiscal year.
This prevention policy governs the behaviors of members as employers. However, it does not encompass member-to-member interaction. As mentioned by the law clerk, the House adopted a motion instructing the Standing Committee on Procedure and House Affairs to explore policy option for handling complaints of harassment among members on November 27, 2014. A subcommittee at that point of PROC was created to A, examine policy options for addressing complaints of harassment between members of the House of Commons, B, propose a code of conduct to prevent and address workplace harassment with a clear definition of harassment, C, make recommendation concerning a fair, impartial, and confidential process, including options for the role of an independent third party for resolving complaints made under the code, and finally, D, to make recommendation concerning training and education initiatives to ensure compliance with the code. On June 9th, 2015, the Code of Conduct for members of the House of Commons Sexual Harassment was adopted by the House following a study and report presented at PROC. En 2018, le Code a été...
In 2018, the Code was revised. On May 31st, 2018, the Standing Committee on Procedure and House Affairs adopted the revised draft report entitled Code of Conduct for Members of the House of Commons, Sexual Harassment Between Members. The revised version of the code was then introduced and adopted in the House of Commons on June the 20th, 2018. Improvements include aligning the Code of Conduct with the members of the House of Commons Harassment and Violence Prevention Policy at the time, adopting a limitation period, and implementing an investigation process.
Members to confidentially raise concern of sexual harassment by other members to the Chief Human Resources Officer or their whip, and provide a process for mediation and investigation. Following an investigation, a report may be sent to this committee, PROC, for further action, who in turn may bring it to the House's attention if discipline against the member is contemplated. Any changes to the code would originate through PROC and would ultimately have to be adopted by the House. Currently, there is no regime that addresses harassment of non-sexual nature between members. Finally, the House of Commons has a policy on harassment and violence prevention, which governs the House of Commons administration. This policy of harassment prevention and resolution in the workplace was first approved by the Clerk of the House on the advice of the Clerks Management Group on April 1st, 2015. Following the legislative changes to the Canada Labour Code Part 2 Our current policy was approved March 24th, 2021 by the Clerk of the House of Commons, again on the advice of the Clerk's Management Group. The legislative required a review of policy is presently ongoing. And
Ms.
will be
Evangelista,
presented.
sorry to interrupt. We're a minute over, so if you can wrap up, please. Thank you.
Yeah. I would actually conclude over our opening remarks by emphasizing that the House administration is dedicated to fostering a safe, healthy, and positive workplace, and we're happy to answer questions that you may have. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Colleagues, we will now begin the first round. As you know, each party will have 6 minutes. Mr. Calkins, I believe you're the first up, so the floor is yours.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you to the witnesses for always coming to this committee whenever we need to hear from you. I guess I will let you decide who is best positioned to answer the question based on the nature of the question after you hear it. So I just want to be clear about the jurisdiction. So understanding jurisdiction here. The jurisdiction of the members of the House of Commons Workplace Harassment and Violence Prevention Policy, what is that jurisdiction?
The jurisdiction for that is largely members as employers. So it targets largely the employees of members.
And it does not deal with member-to-member interaction, just so we're clear.
That's correct.
Who would have jurisdiction to make a decision about anything that happens between members? Where is that jurisdiction?
I'll maybe turn this one over to Michelle, but I think that's where there's a bit of a void.
The House will unquestionably have the jurisdiction to govern the conduct between members to members and put in place a regime as it did for sexual harassment.
Right.
And the House, for such matters, will oftentimes act on the recommendation of PROC, and actually the first order of reference to this committee in 2014 contemplated that the study and the ultimate code will cover all form of harassment, but ultimately the report only covers sexual harassment. Now, if Boy was to put in place a regime that were to intend to apply members to member, it could work in a certain way, but Boy's authority is limited. So, for example, any disciplinary measures will have to be confirmed by the House if we're talking about suspensions or any other sanction that requires a decision from the House. But unquestionably, this committee has the authority to make a recommendation on member-to-member harassment.
So that's a bit of a challenge, obviously, because the chamber, the House, is designed to be adversarial. So can any of you offer members of this committee any advice on the definition of adversarial versus the definition of harassment? Because it's designed to be that way. And members of Parliament do feel uncomfortable. We're made to feel uncomfortable by our constituents. We're made to feel uncomfortable, and we shouldn't feel comfortable in our jobs. This is the nature of our democracy. So in the delineation of feeling uncomfortable because of the duties in the adversarial environment that we're in by design, how do we rationalize what is feeling uncomfortable through harassment or feeling uncomfortable because you just got political pressure put on you in an adversarial system?
It's a very good question, Mr. Calkins, because you're right. The House of Commons is a very unique workplace with a very unique mandate, as you just described. So any definition in terms of what is acceptable, I guess, the acceptable roles of members in the House, either on the government side or opposition side, versus what falls into the area of harassment is something I would anticipate this committee would want to reflect on if it was decided to go that route. And I think any regime, if one was to be put into place, would have to take into account the fact that proceedings in the chamber and in committee are overseen by parliamentary privilege. Maybe, Michelle, you want to expand a bit on that?
If I may, there are some jurisdictions that have adopted a code of conduct.
Sure, I'm having a hard time hearing. Can you move your microphone, Mr. Bedard?
Okay.
So, yeah.
Is it better this way?
Hope so.
Okay. There are some jurisdictions that have adopted a code of conduct that will apply to all form of harassment, but they carve out parliamentary proceedings. So, for example, the Senate has a policy that will apply to conduct between senators, but it does not apply to all actions that are taking place during parliamentary proceedings. Everything that is taking place during parliamentary proceedings will be addressed to the procedural means that are already available, be it a question of privilege or question of decorum, that are usually enforced by the chair or the speaker.
Okay, thank you, Chair. So my last question is then, what constitutes the parliamentary area? Just for clarification, the House of Commons obviously does, a committee space does. Our offices and any place in the parliamentary precinct, what about our constituency offices?
Normally, in terms of parliamentary proceedings, in terms of privilege, it's just the House, the Chamber, and committees.
Well, we can attend the chamber from our constituency office. We can attend the chamber from our house. We can attend the chamber from anywhere in Canada as long as we have an adequate internet connection. Yeah. This needs to be clarified.
Right.
The concept of parliamentary proceedings will exist whether you participate in proceedings through virtual means, through Zoom, with the video conference as authorized by the House. So the jurisdictions that have applied harassment to all conduct will have carved out the parliamentary proceedings. That I gave the example of the Senate, but there are other examples in Canada that have carved out parliamentary proceedings from the applications of their code of conduct or policies when it applies to members
See, I don't differentiate.
Mr. Calkins will have
Sorry.
to wrap up right away.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay, thanks very much. Ms. Romanato, over to you for 6 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and through you, I'd like to thank the witnesses for being here. As you mentioned, it was recommended to PROC that this be looked at almost 10 years ago. So I don't want to say delighted that we're actually getting to it because it took us 10 years, but I have a list of questions. Mr. Calkins actually got a few of them in, so that's good. So right now, as you mentioned, the current members of the House of Commons Workplace Harassment and Violence Prevention Policy does not cover harassment between members. So what would be the recourse for a member of Parliament who is undergoing harassment by another member? What would be their recourse at this point?
Thank you for the question. So as it stands today, we're always encouraging, we really review it case by case, right? So you are able to come forward and actually speak to us, and it really depends on the situation. We also work very closely with the Sergeant at Arms to ensure from a safety perspective. So I think, that's our first line of defense is reviewing every case, making sure that the environment is safe from a physical safety perspective. Then what we do is, should it be under the Code of Conduct sexual harassment, then we go that route. If it is not, then we actually refer you back and with a whip. And there, yeah.
I'm going to cut you off because I have lots of questions, so my apologies.
Yeah.
So not dealing with sexual harassment, not physical safety. What I'm talking about is, say, psychological harassment. And my home province of Quebec was one of the leaders in terms of bringing forward legislation to prevent workplace psychological harassment. So right now, there is no recourse really available. And from what I understand, there is no even mediation available to members of Parliament that are undergoing psychological harassment. Is that correct?
There's always, Phil, thank you for the question. There's always an opportunity for the member HR team to actually provide any type of support. So there are external resources. There's coaching available for you. It's just the recourse is not there, as you mentioned.
And you mentioned that in the event of a situation, a member can go to their whip. Do whips and deputy whips of caucuses receive basic human resources training or harassment prevention training? And if not, would you recommend that they do so?
Yes, thank you. So every member of the House of Commons actually does receive the training and is available to them, including the whips.
Okay. Now, my colleague mentioned how would you define the workplace of members of Parliament because of the multiple jurisdictions in which we work. So right now, would we fall under the Ontario Occupational Health and Safety Act, or because of the multiple jurisdictions, where would we fall as members of Parliament? Because we could be at an event, we could be traveling, we could be in our constituents, we can be here on the Hill. What jurisdiction do we fall under?
I'm going to refer that to Michelle.
As a member of the federal parliament, your workplace will be governed by the Canada Labour Code Part 2. So that's the authority. Now, traveling, it's possible that there might be some other health and safety regime that will kick in depending on if you have an event in another workplace. But you as an employer and your workplace, the constituency office, is governed by the Labour Code.
Okay. So I have a weird question. It may sound a little weird, but I'm going to give you some context. In May of 2015, the Reform Act amended the Parliament of Canada Act, and it requires that the first caucus meeting after an election, 4 votes must take place, including a vote on the expulsion of a caucus member. Has a legal opinion been sought out to ensure that this is in line with labor laws? For instance, if a member is undergoing harassment and or a victim of harassment, what's to say that if their caucus has passed the Reform Act to allow caucus members to kick out a member of caucus, essentially with 20% of their caucus, how could this amplify harassment or actually even prevent a member from coming forward out of fear of reprisal by being thrown out of caucus?
Thank you for the question. That's indeed a very interesting question. The Reform Act came into force and was implemented before the Labour Code was put in place. I will say my preliminary opinion, they govern different things. As you know, caucus have to decide which portion is to be applicable to their caucus. It applies to the membership, expulsion of members, also leaders may be subject to a vote by their caucus. I would not qualify the exercise of power under the Reform Act as potentially an act of harassment, as members are exercising their right under the Parliament of Canada Act. Same thing when they are participating in proceedings in the House and voting. I'm afraid that's all I could offer today, but that's indeed a very interesting question.
Okay. Do I have any more time? No?
Unfortunately not.
I'll maybe get another round.
Okay,
Thank you.
merci. Madame Gaudreau, à vous pour 6.
Thank you, Madame Gaudreau. You have 6 minutes. Thank you very much, Chair. Well, after all this time, I have the impression that we're actually going to get there. I'm pleased that we're able to raise our concerns because, in fact, a member's role is very broad, and there is a large gray area. There is a lot of parliamentary jousting, and I think that this is an excellent opportunity to define, and actually here, to determine what is legitimate, what can hurt. This is where we are now. So as far as I'm concerned, I hope that we will be able to quickly come to an agreement with criteria which will resemble what we've seen at the Senate, criteria which could resemble what's being done in Quebec's National Assembly, because we can't not deal with this. Now, I have understood that when we're talking about member to members, we're in the right place. That was really my initial question. What is the role of boy? So I'm reassured. You also talked about procedures, but right off the bat, I'd like to hear from you about what steps we should be following so that we can have a report, recommendations, and pass it in the House quickly. So I don't know who would like to try to address this. Perhaps I could begin, and my colleagues can add. I understand your concern, wishing to proceed quickly. We have to take everything into consideration. As Carolyn was saying last time, when the code was created, it was done by a subcommittee, so that's one option. You could create or recreate a subcommittee that takes the time to review the issues, and we could assist and come back to the committee and then to the House with recommendations. I don't know whether Michel or Caroline, you have anything to add to that? The process as described applies if the committee were to recommend amendments to the sexual harassment code of conduct, which is within the purview of this committee, and then make recommendations to the House. A subcommittee, as has been recommended last time, would perhaps be a form that was considered in the past to be more appropriate for this kind of discussion. If the decision were to be to make amendments to the policy, as I mentioned earlier, the policy was adopted by the Board of Internal Economy, so it's the PROC cannot make changes. If after deliberations the committee wants to see changes to the policy, then I think the idea would be to invite Boy to review the matter. So what I've understood is that we have to do our work for the portion that involves member-to-member behavior, but that we have to work together with the Boy because the sexual harassment policy is complete, but it's missing this part because we've had training, because we're employers, and I've understood that part. Right now, the code applies to sexual harassment. It's very tempting to say we'll simply remove the word sexual and then and that'll resolve the matter. But that would be the beginning of the work to be done. If the political will was to subject everything to this code of conduct, that is one thing, but you have to examine what the other exceptions would be. You talked about parliamentary proceedings or debates, and it's more than just removing the word sex or sexual in the code. There are other amendments that would have to be made. In terms of time, with having a subcommittee meeting with Boy, making proposals, what's reasonable in terms of a time frame? Last time it was brought to us, I think the committee took about 6 to 10 meetings before they were able to bring forward everything. So I would recommend a similar amount of time to ensure that all the necessary studies have been done to be able to bring to you the best possible recommendations for Canada and even internationally. Last question. Do I have 30 seconds left? Do you have everything to be able to make the proposals, or do you have to do any other work? Well, we have certainly already done work, but we can do more. Thank you. Thank you very much, Ms. Gaudreau.
Listen, we will go to you. I will just note that at the tail end of your questions, there may be bells that we have to deal with, but for now, we're in the clear. So I turn it over to you for 6 minutes.
Okay, I'll power through, Mr. Speaker. Thank you. This is all incredibly interesting. One of the reasons why I was so interested in ensuring that this study occurred, I sat as a staffer on that subcommittee. And it was all done in camera, so I have to remember what I can and cannot say overall. I'm sure we all appreciate that. However, as was noted, we started with a much broader mandate. And because there could not be any sort of agreement whatsoever under that current government and makeup of the committee on what harassment was, we were forced to come up with that much more narrow agreement on sexual harassment. which was truly disappointing for me as a staffer, let alone not knowing where my future would lay, and as an actual legislator. So I think that although it took 10 years, it's really important to get here. I'm interested to hear your perspectives on the change of culture. It was mentioned that we are a historic adversarial type of workplace, but that doesn't have to necessarily be the case. We have the power to change that. We have the ability to change that. There has to be a desire and political will to change that. But I'd like to see, there have been a number of new security programs initiated. Parliamentarians are now offered trial programs through PPS security, off precinct. There's been panic buttons for some time, but all of these things are being added to our constituency office for sure as well. I would like to know observations on the rise of harassment and violence in Canadian politics overall, the deliberations around creating these programs, and what has been the driving force in terms of that increase in incidents.
Maybe, Pat, can I just quickly start and then hand off to you? You're right. There absolutely has been an increase in threats and what have you to members, often anonymous threats through social media or what have you. That's almost a completely separate subject, and Pat can speak to it in terms of what measures have been taken to date to assist members in addressing that. But that is a separate subject from the issue of member-to-member harassment. But I'll let Pat update the committee in terms of what's been done recently and what's up ahead.
I can note that there are state...
Sorry to interrupt, Mr. McDonald. I do see that we have bells that have just begun. Colleagues, I'm looking to see if we have unanimous consent to work through the bells, and also if committee members are comfortable voting electronically. That keeps us all here and allows us the opportunity to move forward. But if not, then...
No, I
Okay.
need to vote in person,
No,
but I would be prepared to go 5 minutes until.
Okay, sounds good, colleagues. So we will restart the clock in a moment, and we'll keep an eye out for 5 minutes before votes. Members can, of course, choose to vote electronically or in the chamber. And then once we have all members back, if that happens before 10 minutes, great, we'll get going. And if not, then at the 10-minute mark, we will begin again. Mr. McDonald, apologies for the interruption. Back to you.
Yes, so there's been a significant increase in the last 5 years in harassment of the members of Parliament, mostly online, but also in person and at events, and by significant, probably in the tune of 700-800% increase. And the same for, to give you an example, on threat behaviors towards towards the MPs. In 2019, there was approximately 8 files we opened up on threat behaviors towards either a direct or indirect threat towards an MP, and in 2023, there was 530 files opened. So that's a significant increase of threats and threat behavior, mostly threatening behavior towards the members of Parliament. For the harassment of MPs online, it's come to the point where we're bulk filing the harassment of MPs online, that it's so bulk filing, there's just so much of it, and the social media platforms are, one, either not taking our call or taking our call and saying, yes, we'll look into it, and it ends there. Because it's according to their rules if they take it down, the malicious or harassing posts, and it's up to them to take it down. Anyone can report it in if the post doesn't meet their rules or regs, but it's up to the social media platform to remove it. And we're not having much luck as of late having them remove it.
So while that might be a separate question versus member to member, it certainly would have an impact on members, certainly has an impact on staff. So as an employer, what obligations do we have around that impact?
Clerk Darren.
1 minute remaining.
So I think, again, it's about providing a health and safety environment. I think that is the most important. So it's about, if you come and speak to us from an HR perspective, we have resources. We have nurses on site. We have actually a respectful workplace that could support employees, making sure that from a mental state perspective, they feel safe. We have training available. Of course, we're not going to, eliminate it, but it's about mitigating the risk for reoccurrence. So that is an obligation that we do have.
And I guess I don't know if I can get it in. Maybe I can bank my time if the chair
You
is so
have
kind.
20 seconds, Ms. Matheson. Happy to roll it over for next
Thank
round.
you. I request that, sir.
Good. Okay. Thank you very much, Ms. Matheson. Okay. Ms. Ferreri, over to you for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Chair. Thank you for having me here. It's my first time at PROC. Thank you for this. This is a very interesting study that I have plenty of personal experience with. I'm sure you've seen my name in the bulk files many times. I guess my question to you about when we're talking about online harassment to members or that kind of thing, for you and your team, what do you have in place to support yourself to actually act on this?
Through you, Mr. Chair, we have an open source intelligence unit who employ a number of different softwares. And right now we focus mostly just because of the number of files, which are threats or indirect threats. That's our focus. And we reach out to the police force of local jurisdiction and the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, the protective operations. Once we feel, or if we feel that there may be criminal intent there.
I guess where I'm going with this is a couple of twofold question. We know our police are extremely inundated, overwhelmed. They also don't have the resources often to follow up, not just in this instance, but in many domestic violence instances. Many issues go sort of left to the bottom of the queue because there is so many other issues, whether it be overdoses or, calls of those kinds of things. So my question is twofold. Number one, I'd be curious to have the data, if you want to table it to the committee, how you've had to change your staffing, and have you had to increase staffing and resources, and what does that cost look like? And in what time frame have you seen that jump? And then also, how do you prioritize if your resources are spread as thin as they are in, say, the instances of police?
Real quick. In terms of police following up, I think what's often frustrating for members, and it's a genuine concern, is, and it's maybe a more legal question, the definition between when harassment becomes a threat and becomes criminal. And that's often a fine line. In terms of staffing, very recently the Board of Internal Economy adopted a significant increase in resources to assist the Sergeant-at-Arms and his team that work closely, of course, with Parliamentary Protective Services and the RCMP and other jurisdictions. So maybe, Pat, you can give a bit of detail on what that will see us have going forward.
So, as the clerk said, there's been a significant investment in my area in the last month to resource us up and keep our nose above the waterline and deal with the massive workload which we are now facing. We're very confident that we'll be able to handle the workload for the foreseeable future. In regards to the cooperation with the police force of jurisdiction, we deal with 91 police forces. We have agreements with 61 to provide paid duty at members' events and provide security when a member hosts or attends a public event. To date, the RCMP have been excellent to move quickly on files that may have a criminal intent or.
What is your key and what is your timeline that you have as your goal to respond? Do you have one internally that you're saying, okay, we've received this message, we have a timeline that we've put in place for us to follow up.
We try to get our files as quickly as possible. If there's a threat there, we'll same day get to that file. Often within minutes, we get to the file, and sometimes with the cooperation of police force of jurisdiction and the RCMP, we can act on the file the same day. And I had an example of that in recent memory where the threat came in against a member of parliament in the morning, and the person was in custody out west in Western Canada by bedtime.
Your team has been amazing when I've had to reach out, so I do commend you on that. The other major question I think that a lot of people online are having is
we're at about 20 seconds.
20 seconds is bots, differentiating between a real person and a bot. What are you doing to ensure that?
Well, that's my open source intelligence team, and I would have to come back to you with an answer because that's getting into technical information that I don't quite understand.
Thanks very much, Ms. Ferrari. Next, we have Ms. Damoff for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for the opportunity to sit into the PROC committee today. I want to follow up on the line of MP to MP harassment. And when it was asked about social media, I think, Mr. Jantz, you said that's a separate matter or a separate subject, except my question is, what happens when an MP puts on social media something that directly drives harassment of the MP? So they mention another MP specifically in social media, which in turn drives phone calls, emails, and social media threats and misogyny. And I've been subject to that repeatedly. So I would argue it's not a separate subject. And I don't know how we deal with that, but I just wonder if you could talk about the impact of MPs' social media on other MPs.
No, thank you for the clarification, Ms. Damoff. And you're right. When I spoke about social media as separate, I meant like members of the public, anonymous people sending threats and the like. But you're right. Sometimes you have occasions where there is member-to-member exchanges on social media, or what you're alluding to, a member does something that causes an impact then on another member. It again becomes a bit of a jurisdictional issue. For instance, the speaker has jurisdiction in the chamber between interactions between members, but has no jurisdiction over exchanges between members on social media. I don't know, Michelle, if you want to add to that.
Well, currently, there's no House instruments that will govern this relationship. The Code of Conduct sexual harassment is limited to sexual harassment, as its title indicates, and the policy does not apply to member-to-member conduct. Of course, if the tweet or what is posted on social media reaches a certain threshold that it's criminal harassment, then it will be subject to the criminal code, but we haven't had any example of such a matter.
So I'm not talking about the actual MP and criminal harassment. I'm talking about the MP tweeting, for example, knowing that, with misinformation often, but targeting another MP. So the MP says Pam Demoff has just compared every hunter in Canada to the Danforth shooter. And then what follows from that is the very large gun lobby sending much more than mean tweets, which is what they've called them, but they've been threats and absolutely horrific messages to my office, phone calls from across Canada, which impact my staff. So it's the MPs, what they have tweeted has directly resulted in harassment of my staff and myself. So it's not the MP saying the criminal harassment, it's inciting other people to do so.
Currently, there's nothing, no House policy or code of conduct that will address such a behavior.
Do any other jurisdictions have policies with respect to MP harassment?
Yeah, so there's 9 across legislative around Canada that do, and internationally as well. Both UK and Australia also have an MP to MP.
Would you be able to share those policies with us?
Absolutely.
Okay,
yeah.
thank you. Yeah, I wanted to talk a little bit about our staff, which Ms. Matheson brought up, because while there are resources available to them, I often hear people say to me, "Well, you don't have to look at your social media," but the problem is somebody is looking at it. My office set up a whole subfolder in our inbox called misogyny. So maybe to talk about how this is impacting staff.
Yeah.
In 20 seconds.
We encourage you to actually let us know. And like mentioned earlier, there are mental support for the staff, and we want to make sure that they feel secure themselves. So I would encourage for us, Pat also shares with me whenever there are instances where there are tweets that could harm the staff, and we're proactively reaching out as well to make sure that they're okay.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. Madame Gaudreau, c'est à vous encore pour 2 minutes.
Ms. Gaudreau, over to you for 2.5 minutes. Very well. Thank you, Chair. Given everything that we've heard, I think we can conclude that it is important and urgent to have a proposal and have a subcommittee to be able to examine what exists elsewhere, what's worked well. In some cases, there's some catch-up required. When the Sergeant at Arms is telling us that we have 700 to 800% increase in online harassment, this says clearly that our efforts have to increase at the same pace. Right now, we can't keep pace, so let's take advantage of this opportunity. On behalf of democracy and public safety, when I meet people in my riding, not only do they tell me, "Are you going to still continue? How do you feel when you're treated that way or called that way?" And when I talk to my kids who are 20 years old, they say, "I'll never go into politics." But often when I meet colleagues in other jurisdictions who have resigned because of the harassment that they received within their organizations, I think the time is ripe. We must proceed with this revision, and we can talk for hours and hours, but we have to be constructive and set up a subcommittee and work together with Boy so that beginning in September we can make proposals so that we can do this before the end of 2024. I'd like to know your opinion about this. I understand your recommendations. We take them, and we are prepared to assist you. Thank you. That's it for me. Thank you. Excellent. Thank you very much, Ms. Gaudreau.
30 seconds from the previous round, so you're at 3 minutes, okay?
Excellent. Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I'm interested to talk more about that parliamentary privilege divide. Of course, that is so key in terms of our democracy, that freedom of speech is so incredibly important. It is one of the basis of this place, this institution. But there have been limits placed upon that in previous, with the sexual harassment policy, member to member. So where are the boundaries? Like, where does parliamentary privilege end? Can you talk about the principles of how we would decide even upon that? Fine lines, your worries about that as well.
As was alluded to, there are several jurisdictions that do have codes to govern member-to-member behavior, and I think the vast majority of them deliberately and explicitly exclude what goes on in the chamber and in committees. And the goal, I think, in that is to protect the privileges of members in their deliberative functions and ensure that any situations that arise in those forums are dealt with according to the procedures and the rules in those forums. So there's a speaker who is responsible for ensuring decorum in the chamber. There is a chair who is responsible for maintaining decorum in a committee. And there are processes by which the House can sanction misconduct should it occur in those forums. So a lot of, I think the vast majority of codes that other legislatures have adopted have deliberately carved that out with, I think, the fear of what would members welcome, for example, outside investigation into what goes on during proceedings? I guess that's the question that members would have to decide in considering that.
In terms of those boundaries and what those chairs within the House or committee have, do they have the proper tools already existing to be able to do that job? Do they have the appropriate training to do that job? Is that something that we need to work on as well?
I think that would be a question for members to decide. That there is, I think, certain standards of decorum that are expected and that are attempted to be enforced. Whether members think those standards are sufficiently high, I think, is a question for members to answer. And whether or not the sanctions available to the chairs or to the speaker are sufficiently high, I think, is also a question members could consider.
Decorum is pretty general term and broad term.
Yes.
So again, it comes from an individual's will to abide by those entirely.
Yes.
And there would be no other option.
I would say if members feel that stronger tools are necessary or stronger sanctions are necessary or different processes are necessary, they would have to incorporate that into the rules. But as multiple speakers have said in multiple rulings about decorum, about language, it's impossible to achieve that, I think, only by enforcement. Members need to have the will to also govern themselves appropriately.
So as a workplace... that was a really fast 3 minutes. Oh.
I'm sorry. Colleagues, just a quick note before we go to the next line of questioning here. So we're going to hit just right at 5 minutes. I'm going to suspend at that point. We go vote. Once folks are back, we're going to continue. We will have one more from the Liberal side and then an entire round subsequent to that. And then that will bring us to the end of this morning's testimony. With that, for 5 minutes, I turn it to Ms. Rempel-Garner. Welcome to PROC.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Jantz, has the House ever undertaken a legal analysis of what portions of various labor codes, be it provincial or federal, apply to Parliament or to the workplace of parliamentarians?
It's a good question, Ms. Rempel-Garner. I'm not aware of any, but maybe Michelle would have some details.
Until changes to the labor code in 2019, which came into force a year or 2 years later through what was known as Bill C-65, which made applicable to amendment to what we call PESRA, the Parliamentary Employment and Staff Relations Act. Prior to these amendments, the health and safety provision of the labor code were not applicable to Parliament as a workplace. That said, there were provisions, policies in place at the administration level, but there was no specific legal requirement except the general legal requirements of employers.
What about provincial labor code?
Provincial labor code will not apply to federal entities. They were really subject to federal legislation, so that's why until amendments were made to PESRA and then to the labor code to make it applicable to parliamentary employers, the provincial labor codes were not applicable.
So if someone was to say that they're entitled to a safe workplace here, parliamentarian, the federal or provincial labor codes would not apply in that sense outside of the amendments that were made in legislation in 2019. Is that correct?
Well, the changes that were made to the legislation in 2019 made applicable Part 2 of the Canada Labor Code almost in entirety with some adjustments, minor adjustment to Parliament as a workplace and to all parliamentary employers, including members.
Thank you. I have made a very purposeful choice in my career to not platform any of the harassment that I've received, and I will continue that. I will say, because it's a matter of public record, that I think I was the first case of criminal harassment that was prosecuted on Twitter writ What, Mr. Jones, your team here has talked about the fact that there are criminal laws regarding harassment. What services do your team offer to link parliamentarians with the appropriate legal services when instances of criminal harassment occur?
It's very much a partnership, I would think. Our Office of the Law Clerk is involved, the Sergeant at Arms Office is involved, our IT folks who are in close contact with some of the cybersecurity institutions are involved, police forces of jurisdiction, Parliamentary Protective Service. So there's a lot of players involved. But maybe, Pat, you want to give a bit more detail?
A typical case would be made aware of the complaint. First contact is RCMP. And second contact with the RCMP is police force of jurisdiction. We reach out to them. The case is discussed. Often it's obvious that it is a criminal harassment case.
At this point, though, it's fairly, it would be reactive, right? So in terms of your team offering those, making MPs aware of like what to do in those circumstances, it's reactive right now. Is that correct?
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. Perhaps that's something that the committee could consider as a recommendation. I remember a time where a colleague of a different party gave a 5-minute missive in the House of Commons about the fact that I had blocked them on Twitter after they had sent a lot of junk my way. I would just, colleagues, with this 45 seconds, since I'm segueing into this committee, I would just urge colleagues on their recommendations to ensure that we are not using legitimate, if there are recommendations that they're made on legitimate grounds, not as a way to litigate partisanship. And I would hope that whatever recommendations come out of this study, that partisanship is removed and scoring partisan points is removed, because this is a really serious issue. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, thanks very much, Ms. Rempel-Garner. Okay, colleagues, we are going to suspend in order to deal with our voting responsibilities, and we will come back shortly thereafter. Thank you.